In this video, I really want to talk about what I consider to be the true secrets to finding deep or offshore bass during the summer. Now, this is going to apply mostly to those of you who have a boat with some standard electronics, or those of you who want to have a boat someday with some standard electronics. I'm not going to talk about live sonar in this video because that's kind of a different topic for a different day. Mostly I'm going to talk about side imaging, down imaging, and mapping. Now, to me, there are four really big things that I think if you fully understand them, it will help you to start catching fish a lot quicker offshore during the summer. Now, the first one is actually something that I thought was kind of a scam for a number of years, but that is having clean power to your electronics. And like I said, I thought that this was kind of a scam for years because people were selling these wire harnesses for $400, and all that it really is, you know, the ones that you see out there a lot are just wires. It's a thicker wire that you connect from your battery to your units themselves. Now, over the years, over the last couple of years, I actually had Boat Things, which is here in Columbus, install a custom wire harness. And what they do that's a little bit different is they will actually incorporate fuses on your wire harness. They obviously install it. They also put in a disconnect switch, and they use waterproof connections. These are all things that are a little bit different. And actually, if you are interested in getting a wire harness from Boat Things, if you let them know that Tyler Berger sent you or Bass Fishing HQ sent you, you can actually get this whole process done, including installation, for $450. So basically, for the exact same price as a lot of these wire harnesses you will find online, you can get the whole thing done for you by Boat Things for $450. So it's a really great deal. I'm gonna leave a link down below in the description. But the thing about these wire harnesses and having this direct power to your graphs is it really allows your graphs to work properly without interference, and it helps you to see things a lot better, including the fish. And so that actually kind of brings me to point number 2 that I want to talk about, and that is one of the main things that I am always going to look for, even more so than bass themselves while graphing, is bait. It's really, really important for me these days to find areas that have bait, because this is something that I've seen over the years that has happened a lot, is that sometimes you will actually see bass on your graphs. For me, I always have down imaging or my 2D imaging pulled up, and if I find a little offshore break or a hump that has bass on it, sometimes you can get those bass to bite your lures if there's no bait in the area. But when there is bait in the area, if you're seeing clouds of shad, or if you're seeing bluegill, or even if you're seeing crappie, it seems like the fish that are around bait are just easier to get to commit to your lures. And I've seen this time and time again. And actually, it was very frustrating to me before I fully understood how important it is, and before I kind of understood the behavior of bass, because I think that there are a lot of lakes in the country where bass will set up on deeper structure points and offshore places, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But they wait until the bait comes around them, and then they start feeding. So they're set up on these areas, but they won't really bite well until the bait is in the area. So I think that it's really important that you find bait in your areas. And the best thing about bait is if you have that clean power like we talked about going to your electronics, it's very easy to see. It's very easy to see crappie and bluegill. It's very easy to see balls of shad out there. And one thing about shad that I think is really important is that you will see at times if they are really balled up tightly, if these fish are like in a really tight ball, like literally it looks like a circular ball in the water, those are fish that are that way because they are being fed on. They are being eaten. Shad that are really tightly balled up. I mean, if you've ever seen ocean, bait fish in those really tight balls, that's because you have like tuna and marlin that are like going through them to eat them. And the same thing kind of applies to bass. When you see those really tight balls, that really gets me kind of interested in being like, hey, there are fish that are feeding on these bass, right? Or feeding on these bait fish right now. Let's drop our baits down. Let's start catching fish. So always look for bait to be present in areas. I can't tell you how important this is. Now, the third thing that I want to talk about is time. And I really want you to fully understand time here, because what happens a lot of times when we are fishing the bank, when we are fishing shallow cover, is the same thing that happens in deeper water. But it's harder to do in deeper water, because in deeper water, when you're idling around, you're not actively fishing. And so it makes you feel like you're wasting time. But think about this. If you are fishing the bank, what happens so much of the time? You're flipping and pitching, maybe you're throwing a spinnerbait, a chatterbait, a topwater, whatever it may be, you are actively casting. So you feel like you're always around fish. You feel like you're always about to catch a fish. But what happens most of the time is that you will go 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards, a mile, and you won't catch a dang thing. And then all of a sudden you find that one little stretch. Maybe it's a little point. Maybe it's just a small bend, or maybe it's just some sort of stretch where all of a sudden you catch 4 or 5 fish in the matter of 15, 20, 30 minutes, right? You were fishing for 2 hours and you caught 5 fish, but they were all in a 15-minute time frame. That is what happens a lot when we are fishing the bank. Now, you kind of have to take this same mindset to fishing deep, because when you are out there actively graphing and looking at your electronics, you might spend an hour, you might spend 2 hours, you might spend 3 hours just graphing before you find anything that is like worthy of making a cast. But once you find that area, even if it's just one area, it could be an area where you pull up and make 5 casts in a row and catch 5 bass in a row, or even more. You might find a giant school where you can just sit there and catch fish all day. So you really have to kind of think of it the same. The biggest difference is that we're sitting in a chair and looking at electronics, and it's not actively fishing. And it makes it very, very hard. But the thing that I have realized is that when you are graphing, the best thing you can do is really wait to fish an area that like you get excited about, because this is what happens. And bear with me just a moment. If you're graphing for an hour long and you keep looking at stuff, you might find some really good structure. You know, you might find a really good looking rock pile, or you might find a really good looking brush pile. But a lot of times for me anymore, if I don't see bass or bait or both, I'm not even gonna get up and make a cast. I might mark those areas with a couple of waypoints, but I'm not going to make a cast unless I really see all the ingredients that I wanna see, which is mostly bait and definitely some bass. But if I find a good piece of structure, whether that's a brush pile, a rock pile, a good grass line, and I have bait, those are those places that are worthy of making casts. And the big thing about that too is when I jump up on the front deck of my boat, I'm only gonna make a few casts in that particular area. And usually you will start catching fish pretty quickly if they are actively feeding, which again, I think all stems from them being around bait. So these are what I consider a couple of the true secrets. Now there's one other thing that is very, very important to understand, and that is what I'm gonna say underwater currents. Now, underwater currents can be made from the wind. You know, if you fish up in the northern part of the country or even the southern part of the country where you have bigger natural lakes, you know, they might, you know, the wind might push water into areas that creates current. Now, if you live in parts of the South or Midwest or anywhere that you have a reservoir, a lot of these reservoirs that are actually made for power generation, at some point during the day, they're going, not always, but sometimes at some point in the day, when it gets real hot out, they're gonna draw current through that dam to create the electricity to power whatever city that they're trying to power. When that happens, it is literally the dinner bell for fish. And what happens is that it will place fish in very specific little areas that are the size of a bass boat, even smaller at times. And it really kind of brings all these fish to a very specific area. So one thing that's really important to understand is current, and how not only should you understand that current is a dinner bell, but you should also understand how current hits offshore structure. This is really, really important, because the places where current hits the most are typically also some of the best places to find these deep water bass, because what happens is that current will hit an area very hard, and it creates a hard bottom. We hear this all the time in bass fishing. You know, I'm catching them on a rough patch out there, a hard patch of bottom. And sometimes this hard patch is just a rock bottom. Sometimes it is a shell bottom. You will find a lot of shell beds around these areas where current is hitting very, very hard. And when it hits these areas, sometimes it creates little eddies, and those bass will sit in those eddies and they will eat a lot of fish. So really, it's important to understand how current hits pieces of structure and how bass are going to set up on them. Now, I want to talk about two things when it comes to current. And one was from a Chris Zaldain video I watched a number of years ago. And he said this, and it really made me think, like, that makes sense. And so he was talking about current, and he was saying that anytime you look at a map or whatever it may be, and you're thinking about how current comes through a system, think about a lazy river. Think about how when you are sitting in an inner tube on a lazy river, all those places where you hit the outside of the lazy river, like the concrete part of the lazy river, that is also kind of the same places where current is going to hit underwater, if that makes sense. So it's basically like those long straight sections where you just have current going all the way. Like in a lazy river, you're not going to hit the sides in those areas, but it's around those little curves. When you have those little curves, the current kind of goes straight, and then it hits up against the wall in that lazy river. The same thing happens underwater when you have these little curves in the creek channel, and where that current hits on those creek channels or on those humps or on those points in these certain little areas, those are hot spots for finding bass. So that's really important to understand. Where that current hits is going to be a big place where bass are. Now, the other thing that you should understand is that I have found, we've heard a lot over the years that bass will hold in non-current areas, you know, and so for a lot of us, we think about the backside of things, where it's like, if you think about it visually, if a bass is sitting behind a tree that current is hitting, they're going to sit right behind that tree. Well, the thing is that the most active fish will typically sit on the front side of structure and or cover. And the thing is that when current kind of hits an object, it kind of almost splits. And there's actually a small eddy where that bass can sit on the front side of that current break. And it's also the first place where bait fish is going to come by. So to me, I have found that some of the most active fish will be on the front side of cover and structure that is underwater. So that's really, really important, again, to understand. These are just like the little nuances of bass fishing and of fishing deep that I want you guys to understand. So guys, those are the 4 big things I think that are really important to understand. A wire harness, time on the water, bait, and current. Those are the big things. If you understand those, then you will be a lot better. Now, I did a full video all about side imaging over on BassFishingHQ, and I think it will help you to understand a little bit more about like what fish look like. And I actually even show an area of where I won a tournament with side imaging. So I'm gonna leave that linked right here. If you guys enjoyed this video, you will like that one. Also, don't forget to check out those wire harnesses at Boat Things. I will leave a link down below in the description. All right, see you guys.